Now going into prophecies that are made in the Gospels. One thing I find interesting is that we don't see the normal prophetic formula that was present in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. We don't typically see "thus says" followed by the name of God. Prophecies in the New Testament don't seem to be made that way. There are statements about what the future holds and about specific events that are supposed to happen and that sort of thing, but for the most part they are just made as statements and they're not explicitly said to be a quote from God. That being said, the narration of Matthew makes it clear that he is supposed to be speaking with authority, and he says outright that he was a man sent by God. So I would infer that these statements about the future are supposed to be prophecies, and I want to focus on one set of these prophecies. What I see as the most noteworthy prophecies in Matthew are the ones that refer to this generation. This generation is a recurring phrase that shows up not only in the statements about the future, these prophecies, but also it appears in some of his teachings and some of his general rebukes of the people. I'll go into some of these mentions of this generation and of the generation in general so that we'll have some context before arriving at the most relevant passages. In Matthew 11:16 through 19, he talks about how this generation assumes fault regardless of circumstances. He says that essentially one can do no right in the eyes of this generation once the people have decided to disbelieve. He says this in reference to himself and in reference to John the Baptist. In 12:38 through 39 and 16:1 through 4, he says that the scribes and Pharisees sought a sign, and then he refers to the wicked and adulterous generation seeking a sign, but that only the sign of Jonah would be given to them. In 12:41 through 45, he implies that this generation will not listen to his teaching and they will not repent, therefore they will be condemned. He also seemingly refers to them removing evil, literally an unclean spirit leaving a person, and then the resulting void being filled with even more evil. He says that this is how it will be with this generation. Also in 23:29 through 36, he criticizes the Pharisees for thinking that they are better than their ancestors and thinking that they wouldn't have killed the prophets of the past had they lived in the days of their ancestors. He says that they are the children of those killers and that they are a generation of vipers. He then says that prophets and wise men will come and be killed by them so that the blood of the righteous will be upon them. All these things shall come upon this generation, he says. In this passage, there's a clear distinction between previous generations and this generation. It's clear that he's talking about this group of people. And then he goes on to say, this generation. Therefore, just as the plain meaning of the text would indicate, the phrase, this generation, refers to their generation. This gives us some context to how this generation is described in Matthew. As to the word itself, it's the same word that is used in Matthew when talking about the genealogy, the different generations of people. In the Shem Tov version, typically uses the Hebrew word dor. As far as I'm aware, the Hebrew word is consistently used in a literal sense, talking about a set of people born around the same time or that general duration of time when that set of people is alive. In fact, it appears in a similar phrase in Deuteronomy 135, talking about this evil generation. And we know that's talking about that specific set of people in that time that had refused to enter into the land. So I don't see any reason to interpret the Hebrew in a non-literal way. In the Greek, the only different way that I've seen the word used in any Greek work was reference to the human race in general when used in the phrase, the generation of the human. But the context that we are looking at here do not support that meaning. It's not the same context. We have verses in Matthew that refer to this generation that talk about one group of people as being separate from another group of people from another time. It's clearly not talking about all people that have ever lived because it simply doesn't fit in those contexts of those verses. there is no clear reference that this generation is anything other than this literal group of adults who are alive at the time and the time period associated with it. So now that we have considered the context for this phrase and also the context for the language being used in these passages, I want to draw our attention to some specific statements which are made about what was supposed to happen with this generation. Matthew 24 gives the most thorough explanation. It starts off talking about how, in reference to the temple in some sense, there is not a single stone upon a stone which will not be brought down. In my view, it's not clear whether this is every structure on the temple compound or just the temple buildings. Next, it talks about how there will be people coming in his name claiming to be the Messiah. There will be war, famine, earthquakes, etc. Many of them will be killed because of him. Many will be snared. Many will hate each other. False prophets will rise and deceive many. Lawlessness will abound. And then it says that the gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all nations, and then the end will come. Great tribulation, the sun and the moon go dark, the stars will fall, and the Son of Man will appear in the clouds, and the elect will be gathered. He then tells his followers to look for the signs, that they are going to see it coming. And then he says all of this will happen before this generation passes. This generation will not pass until all of these things happen. This is not the only time these things are referred to and said they will happen to those people. In Matthew 16:27-28, he says that the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with the angels and reward every man according to his works, and that some of the ones standing here will not die until they see him coming in his kingdom. In Matthew 26:64, when speaking to the high priest, he says that the high priest will see the Son of Man coming after this on the clouds, just like in Matthew 24. In addition, the Son of Man coming on the clouds, according to Matthew 25:31-46, results in the gathering of all nations in the final judgment. Some people say that two of these passages talk about people seeing those events happening, and so maybe it's only talking about those people who were alive back then, only having visions of these events rather than actually seeing them. But the problem with that is that Matthew 24 is talking about the very same things and says they will happen before the passing of that generation. Clearly these are events that were supposed to be seen because those people were seeing them happening, because that's what it says in chapter 24, that the events will happen to this generation. While some of the details of these prophecies could be argued to have happened, such as with the Jewish-Roman wars and some other events, the parts about the second coming and the resulting gathering of all the nations for judgment clearly didn't happen to that generation. I think we would know about it if it had. From what I can see, there are two general frames that people use when they try to look at this and make a counter-argument. Either interpreting that the events were actually supposed to happen with this generation, therefore trying to make it work from that angle, or interpreting that the events didn't actually have to happen to this generation. In my view, if a person accepts what I would consider to be the plain meaning, that the events were supposed to happen with that generation, there does not appear to be any basis for taking the view that it's not a false prophecy. For example, one counter-argument, and granted this is not a very common one, but one is the idea that there must be people alive today from that generation still. So there would be people today, according to the claim, who would be 2,000 years old, and they would supposedly remain alive until these events finally happened, therefore solving the problem. While I'm personally not a fan of just dismissing something because it seems outlandish, I would think that with such a claim, especially since it's a matter of testing a prophecy, that it should be accompanied by some kind of physical evidence, since it goes against everything we know otherwise. Another assertion to go along with accepting the idea that these events were supposed to happen with that generation is the phrase, "this generation must carry a meaning that goes against all other indications of the context and of the usage of the word." While that may be a claim or a belief that's held on to, there's nothing backing this from what I can tell. From everything I have seen, it is simply pure speculation to say that it carries this hypothetical meaning that would prevent these passages from being false prophecies. With those two approaches, I don't think they hold up to any real scrutiny. The other approach I've seen is to claim that Matthew 24 doesn't really prophesy that all of these events are supposed to happen with that generation. The idea is that only some of the events were supposed to happen. One angle was to break up the passage into different sections and then extract the parts that didn't happen and then claim that those are supposed to happen later, not actually to that generation. The other version of this, which seemed to be a little better thought out than the other arguments, was to say that these things, whenever it says all these things will come to pass, is essentially a special category that only refers to certain events and not others. So we look to Matthew 24:3 and say that the disciples were asking, when will these things happen, and what the sign of his coming will be, and of the end of the world. And then they would connect the mention of these things with the part about how all these things will happen before this generation passes. The ultimate argument being that some events would happen, and those are these things, while other events wouldn't happen before this generation passes, but they would not be considered these things, therefore it wouldn't be a false prophecy. As far as these things are concerned, it's a word used hundreds of times in the New Testament, and even in that very chapter, it's used in multiple different ways. To be clear, it is not an obvious technical term. However, it is true that the disciples arguably make a distinction between these things and the events surrounding the second coming and the end of the world. But when they are given the answer, there is not any clear distinction made as to what constitutes these things that were to happen to this generation, as opposed to the things which were going to happen thousands of years later, according to that interpretation. The answer makes no such distinction, and this was even acknowledged by one commentator that I looked at, and his conclusion just seemed to be to not worry about it because he thought the rest would happen eventually. It is true that in verse 33 that one could infer some distinction, even though it's not made clearly, because he says that when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. And right after that he says, this generation shall not pass until all these things happen. So a person could point to those different passages and say that a distinction is implied, therefore it is not a false prophecy. My points that I would use against this would include the times when he says that there are people that are with him who are going to see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom and not having tasted of death before that, and the other time when he tells the high priest that he will soon see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in power. The plain meaning of that, in my understanding, would be that they are going to witness these events happening, specifically the second coming and the judgment. And this just goes along with everything else that is said about this generation. It's just another way of saying that these events are going to happen with this generation, including the second coming. Of course, as I mentioned before, the one angle is just talking about visions, not actually talking about seeing these events, or another angle is to just try to dismiss the actual wording of it, like with the coming on the clouds bit, and try to turn it into being overly metaphorical to where it can basically mean whatever it needs to mean to be true. Well, I think that is clearly just reaching. The other approach of saying that it's visions is not necessarily easy to disprove. The other point I would bring up from my perspective is that all of these events appear to be prophesied of as a sequence of events. Even if a person takes on the belief that these things is a unique category, it says outright in Matthew 24:33 that once they see these things, that it is at the doors. In verse 29, that it will happen immediately afterward. And while someone can argue about the exact meaning of these time frames and the words that mean soon or immediately, I will readily accept that soon doesn't have to be soon in our perspective. But the big problem that I see is that there's no indication of a big gap period like what has actually happened. It doesn't say these events are going to happen and then there will be this 2,000 plus year period of time and then the rest of it will happen. I don't see anything about that in Matthew. What I see is that all these things are supposed to happen and then immediately after, the rest of it should have happened. At this time, I am hesitant to say that this is just totally decisive. There are arguments that could be made to say that it wasn't a false prophecy. I personally would be uncomfortable holding that perspective, but at the same time, I hesitate to just decisively come down on this without any caveat. I know some people will say that I'm just giving too much wiggle room and benefit of the doubt on these passages, but like I said from the beginning, I wanted to approach this from an attempt at being neutral. That is why I've decided to put this into the questionable category rather than including it into the decisively against the law category. Regardless of the category, I think it's still worth some serious consideration.